All right. So, Laravel Meetup, future-proof your Laravel app. How experienced are people in this room with Laravel? Beginners, mid-level, yeah. Use it all the time, live in it, breathe it. Okay. Hopefully, nothing in here will be super crazy for people, even if you're kind of a beginner, because frankly, I'm sort of a beginner. I've done a little bit of Laravel stuff. The backstory of this talk is this is actually the third time I've given a similar talk. The first two versions of it had a extensive demo using a framework called Radar. However, I rewrote the demo in this case to work with Laravel because all of the principles are the same. And so it was actually very satisfying to me to know how easy it was to switch my demo from one framework to the other, because that's kind of the whole point of this talk. If it was difficult, I would have thought, maybe I did something wrong here. So this is who I am. I'm Andrew Schell. I have been developing for over a decade now professionally with PHP. I founded the PHP meetup group here in town. Fortunately, Beth took over for it because I was not doing a very good job for a while. I just got burned out.
I was going to say, you have a lot of other things.
Like heart surgery.
Yeah.
So that's my Twitter, my blog. I'll list this link at the end, but I have all the source code for the demo up on GitHub, so if you want to take a look at that. And I don't know if Beth set up anything on joined in or anything.
I will.
It doesn't matter.
Let me check and see.
If you didn't, it's not a big deal. I just didn't have anything in advance. So, frameworks are awesome. I think nobody would be using Laravel if they didn't see that there was some benefit to using a framework. You know, you are able to really code quickly because so much of the work is done for you already. And that you work on your application and you realize that the framework is going to get updates for you. There's lots of people looking at it. Security bugs are going to be fixed. All sorts of things like that. You know, there's great documentation. When you hire new developers, you can put in your job description, hey, we do Laravel, and that immediately sort of filters out this whole subset of people that says, you know, I know what that means and I know how to do it. They can come in and get up to speed a lot quicker than somebody who had never looked at your, you know, special snowflake framework before. But one thing that people, I think, have a tendency to not realize is that as great as frameworks are, they're still not your application. They are a tool that you're using as a delivery mechanism for your application. You know, your application isn't the Laravel app, it's doing something. You know, the demo I'm going to do today is sort of showing a blog where you're managing your blog posts. You know, you're displaying content for people, or you know, in the case of a bigger software as a service application, you know, some of the products that I work on, you know, are managing expiration dates for grocery stores or something like that. That's what the application is. It's what it does. It's the domain. You know, it's the talking about, you know, what's special about yours. I mean, because there could be all these Laravel apps and they all do completely different things. And like I said, there's also, it's about the delivery mechanism. And so, you know, when you think about Laravel or whatever, you're thinking like, well, we're deploying to the web, but you also can do all sorts of other things. You can have a web API, you can have a command line tool. There's all sorts of things you can do that if you've written your entire application to be a web app, if you come around and say, well, now we need to be able to run these reports, you know, in a, you know, cron job or something like this and send them to people via email, like, is that a problem? Or is that logic separated in such a way that allows you to just easily do that? If it's difficult, it's probably because you're highly coupled. That means that your application is so tightly wound in and glued together with the way that your framework was designed that you can't move quickly. You couldn't switch frameworks easily. You couldn't add a command line tool or an API or something different to it other than what it was originally designed to without essentially rewriting your entire application. I read this quote online. It says, "Oftentimes, I feel the business logic of your application gets buried in controllers or models, which hinders the reusability of your code." I think a lot of people see this, especially with Laravel. You have these great tools like the Eloquent ORM, and you start to put all of your business logic and things into these, ORM entities, which then ties you to Laravel forever. I mean, if you want to switch to something else, yes, it might be great that you could potentially use Eloquent on its own with a different framework and port that stuff over. But if you need to switch to something else like Doctrine, or you have some really complicated queries that need to be ran in straight SQL, or you need to change the way that something's working so that it's pulling out of Redis, it might not be as easy as just changing the configuration file and saying, okay, well now the ORM is going to pull from Redis. Like, it might require changing the architecture to some degree. The first case study I want to talk about here is one of the big products that I work on as part of my day job. I've been working on this for 10 years or 5 years now, and this is a case study of how not to do it. I built it on top of Kohana, which some of you may be familiar with. A lot of people coming from the CodeIgniter world at one point switched over to Kohana because it was sort of the first CodeIgniter inspired framework that was built on PHP 5. So if you didn't want to be stuck with PHP 4 and CodeIgniter, this was really your best bet at that point. It had a lot of the sort of great features that you'd be expecting from Laravel today. It had its own ORM, its own routing, its own process for handling all sorts of things. Unfortunately, I at this point didn't really know about writing a framework independent application, and everything was pretty tightly coupled to this. This is just a screenshot from one of my report controllers, and as you can see, we're just inside of one function, and I don't remember exactly how many lines, but I think there's over 2,000 lines of code in this single constructor, or this controller rather. If you look on the side, this is in Sublime Text. That's sort of the zoomed out view of the code. It's a giant mess, and it's very hard to refactor things because I recently had a report that normally works pretty well, but this particular client wanted to run this report for like a year's worth of data because they wanted to see how things were going over the course of this entire year and export it to an Excel spreadsheet, and it just broke the site because there was no way that we could possibly do this in a web request. So I was like, okay, well, great. I'll just, run a command line script to generate this. And it was a huge problem because this one controller method took input from the query string for the, what filters were implied, what sorts of things we're doing, pulled in a bunch of different queries, what departments were available, what locations were available, what, all sorts of different things that for the filters, not even to generate the report data, but just to populate that page. So when you'd go to that report page, it needed to pull in all the data to show up in each of the individual drop downs for the filters. And then as it goes down, it generates the report data. And then there's even code at the end that, based on some additional flags, are we actually spitting the report out to the web view and running it through a templating engine? Or are we spitting it out through this PHP Excel library to actually allow them to download an Excel spreadsheet? And so to generate this stuff on the command line was not actually possible. It took like the better part of a day to extract that logic out. And even then, it wasn't particularly reusable. I mean, I was able to get a big chunk of it out and rewrite this to use that so that the command line tool and this were using the same piece of code. But even then, it was a huge mess because, even just tying into the ORM or anything like this, everything was still pretty tied together. So I was able to pull out enough to be able to separate it from the web view, but it was still very, very tightly coupled to the database ORM layer and just Kohana in general. So then I discovered, a couple years ago that Kohana was discontinued. They're not supporting it anymore. Nobody's working it on anymore. And so I'm sort of stuck now on this dying, dead framework that as of right now continues to work, but I haven't even tried to see if I can run this on PHP 7. I'm a little bit nervous. If I want to run it on PHP 7 and it breaks, it's going to be up to me to, dig into the source code of the framework, and I've basically forked it at this point, and it's now my framework that I can do whatever I want with. But the solution is more going to be starting to pull as much as I can out of Kohana into its own standalone things, probably using a queue of some sort, but that's not really the topic here today. So what is the solution to this? I came across this blog post called The Clean Architecture by Uncle Bob, who you might know from reading from some of his books like The Clean Coder or just Clean Code, two of his books. He has a lot of different material about how to build and architect scalable applications, not just for the web, but in general. And in this blog post, he showed this diagram that I really liked. And I think this really explains the gist of what I think you should be doing when you write your Laravel application, or any web application or application in general. You think of it in terms of nested layers. In the core, you have your entities. In some cases, you might also call this the domain. This is where you contain your enterprise business rules. This is going to be if you write multiple applications that operate in the same sort of space. So if I wrote a second application separate from DateCheck Pro, but it also dealt with, expiration dates in grocery stores, a lot of the entities would be the same. You could have, products, stores, inventory, things like that would be the enterprise business rules or the entities that you would be using. The way that this works is you see this arrow, this set of arrows on the left side. Any ring can only interact with things inside of its own level or nested within it. So entities shouldn't know anything about any of these layers outside of it. And as you can see, the outside layer is, the database, the user interface, the web. And so that is kind of confusing for a lot of people to say, how am I supposed to write an application that's a web app that doesn't know about the web? And the way you start to do that is with interfaces. And I think during my demo here at the end, it'll really make it clear how to do this. So then your second layer outside of the entities is the use cases. In a earlier video that Uncle Bob had posted at one of the Rails conferences, he talks about interactors, and that's kind of what this layer is. That's your application business rules. So you might almost think of this as not a web API, but this is the API for your application. This is, the individual things you're going to do. So for instance, the example that I'm going to show here today is for a simple blog. And so some of the use cases you might have is, list all posts or create a new post. These are the sorts of things that you would have logic in there about how to do a specific thing, but it would be working with those internal entities that could be spread out across different applications. The next layer outside of that is controllers, gateways, and presenters. And that's your interface adapters. That's really, I think, the meat and potatoes of what you're going to be doing. It's a familiar term if you've been using Laravel or any sort of an MVC framework. What is the controller? That's, really the part of the delivery mechanism that knows how it's being displayed. So it knows, okay, I'm getting this, HTTP request. I have to create an HTTP response with different headers and or redirects or things like this. It also is the gateways to, be the interface into your database or your view layers or things like that. So that can work with your use cases. And some people think that, I've read a few posts about this, and some people actually think each layer should only be able to interact with itself and its next nested layer. So controllers would only be working with that use cases layer. I don't really follow that, and actually if you read the Uncle Bob article, it doesn't seem that he's implying that as well. I think it's totally fine for controllers to be aware of entities. The argument against that is that they don't want those layers to know too much or have to know too much about the inner workings of your application. And that's great. I mean, if you're able to function with use cases directly and that's all that you really do, that's perfect. But in the cases that I've seen, a lot of times what they end up doing is creating a lot of data transfer objects and things like this that are almost the same object as an entity that's just in your use cases layer, and you're copying everything back and forth, and I think that's silly. If you keep your objects fairly simple, there's no reason that a user object couldn't be used in a controller, especially if you're just using it to display data or something like that. And then the outside layer is sort of the things outside of what's your sort of traditional application that you're coding. It's the database, it's the web, it's any devices that you might be interacting with. It talks about external interfaces. So if you're communicating with a third-party API or anything like that, those are sort of the pieces that you're interacting with, that that they come in and interact with your controller. So now is going to be the meat and potatoes of the talk, where I actually show how an application like this could be built using Laravel. There's a lot going on here, so I want you guys to stop me and ask questions at any point during this to clarify things, because it can be a little unusual and overwhelming, especially if you're not super familiar with Laravel. There might be a few things that are just like, well, that's kind of a Laravel thing. That's how it works. But I would be happy to sort of stop and explain to the abilities that I have. So before I get in there too crazy, does anybody have questions about what I talked about so far? No? Okay. So with any of these things, it's kind of tricky to say where do you start, because this is a full-fledged Laravel application. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any way I can zoom up this left column here, but I'll have the code as much as possible. Here's sort of the main folder that you interact with a lot when you're developing a Laravel application. You have your app. Under HTTP controllers, we have a few sort of traditional controllers set up here. I'll go into these more in depth. We have down here under database, I have a migration set up to work with a database schema. We're not going to be interacting with the database quite yet. I'm going to show how some of this stuff can be swapped out, but just know that we do have that kind of functionality in there. We also have under resources a collection of blade templates that we can use.
Blade's like twig?
Similar, yeah. It's actually very interesting because I came from using Twig, And I was very, very confused by what I was doing with Blade until I realized that what Blade essentially does is it's a bunch of regexes to rewrite the Blade template into just a PHP template. So for most things, you're actually just writing a PHP template, and there's just syntax to make that less crazy.
Okay.
So for instance, if you're doing an if statement, pretty much anything in the if can be whatever you would have in an if statement in PHP. You can use just normal PHP functions and stuff. In fact, you can put just PHP tags in here and use PHP directly, which I did in this default template because I didn't see an easy way of just doing a print R. And so in that case, I did do actual PHP tags and it worked just fine. So a couple other things that I want to sort of cover before I dive into the guts of the application is we are using Composer, which is what you're expecting with a modern Laravel application. The default usually is just to have the app namespace pointing at your app directory, but I also in this case added a second one. And so I have the blog namespace pointing at source blog. So I have this separate folder, which wouldn't normally come with Laravel, but this is sort of my code that's separate from Laravel, generally speaking. And this is kind of what I'll be digging into a lot in this talk. This is something that could very easily be split out into its own package. And so instead of, for development purposes and for demo, it makes sense to just put it in here. But there's no reason why this couldn't be deployed as its own complete standalone package that you would just add as a dependency here in your Composer application. And so your Laravel app would literally just be the glue code to make it work with your standalone application, which would have its own unit tests and things like that. One other thing that I don't know how common it is if you're using Laravel is I did make some, in the app service provider, I have a few things to set up and work with interfaces as part of their dependency injection container. And so as we get to these pieces, I'll explain what's happening here as well. So let's start out with sort of the normal flow of an application. Let's actually show the application first so you know what we're doing. Let's close that. So this is an example of what the application does. Is we have a title, content, excerpt here at the top to submit to create a post. Right now this isn't going to do anything if I submit it. And then we have individual posts that you would go to, and this is the content, this is the excerpt. The excerpt is optional, so if it doesn't exist, it just truncates the content and shows the first, 140 characters or something like that. It has some very basic error handling. So if we go and try to do an ID that doesn't exist, it says an error occurred, no post found with ID 7. Let's see, I can zoom this up here a little bit too. And so it's super simple. I mean, there's no authentication, there's no real major error handling at all. It's just kind of to show how the different layers would work.
With authentication, is authentication like the red app logic layer then? Or is it like where does authentication fit in? Is this business logic or is this not business logic?
Right. It would potentially have pieces in all of the layers. So you would have in your, let's see if I can load up that slide here. Here we go. So out in the outside layer for database devices, web and stuff, you might have stuff like cookies for authentication, right? You might have a cookie, or somebody could even be passing in an API token or key of some sort. So that could be coming in from that layer. Your controller would certainly be able to handle that, take that data, know what to do with it. There, however, could be then entities for a user in your system, right? There would be use cases for, logged in, user logs in or something like that. So you would be able to, in your controller, take data from a form, put it in that, and part of your response would be, whether or not that was successful, or here's a, token string that you should do something with that, future authentication would use. You could have a use case of, verify user token, same kind of thing, or get user by token, or it kind of depends on how you want to structure your authentication system, but it would potentially do a lot of different layers because, the way I like to think about it is that concept of different delivery mechanisms. You say, okay, this is a website doing something, but if this was a RESTful API, how would this be similar or different? If this was a command line tool, how would this be similar or different? And that's where you can start to see what's common across those different platforms and what's unique. And that's kind of what differentiates. What's unique between the different delivery mechanisms would be things that would definitely sit in that sort of the blue and green layers. The stuff that was pretty much common in your application across everything would be, primarily, I think, in your sort of red use cases area, but certainly there would be some stuff going on in the entities layer. So let's dive into a controller first for just that home page. So that's this one here. Well, let's see here. We got routes. So it's pretty simple. Get does list all posts controller. Display single post controllers if you have a single ID. And then if you post to the home page, it does the create new post controller. This might look a little funny to you guys. If Laravel was really super smart, I probably wouldn't have needed this at __ invoke, because I have the invoke method set up in those things, which should allow those classes to operate as closures. Because normally you could, in this case, just do, function something else. And so I would have hoped that it would have worked identically, but it seems like, at least in this case, until they fix that, you do have to specify directly that you're calling the __ invoke method. So that's a little dirty, but it is what it is. In the list all posts controller, we have a constructor that gets a interactor, which is what was that sort of use case layer, which I'm calling the action. And then I have a HTML responder, which is under app HTTP responders. This is something that I built specifically as part of this, but it's definitely part of the delivery mechanisms. And so in this case, it's an HTML responder. So I'll show how that works as well. So these are the two things that are handled as part of the constructor. Laravel is really nice about auto-wiring stuff with the dependency injection container. So when I go up here and say, I'm calling this, and it knows to create a new list all posts controller, it knows how to wire this stuff up, because it's like, okay, well, I need to create one of these to pass in, I need to create one of these to pass in, and it just pretty much works magically. When we call invoke on here, which is that main thing, one thing that's a little bit different here, and this is kind of coming from that idea that Radar talks about, but it's a broader idea that Paul Jones likes to talk about, is ADR, or action domain responder. And so instead of having a single controller that contains multiple actions in it, I like the idea of having essentially one action per controller, because especially in this case, you can see that there might be other controllers that are going to have the same kind of constructor because they're expecting the same data, but each of those things could do something different. So for instance, under the create new post controller, it doesn't use the HTML responder, it has a redirect responder that it uses instead. And so it wouldn't make sense to have all of these things passed into your single controller that, some of them use it, some of it don't. I like to keep it a much smaller piece of code that does, one thing. So this one page is handled by this one controller, and it has its constructor, so you can actually inject everything that you need for that to work. So there's not a whole lot going on with it. We do get a request object passed in, and this is an interesting concept that I have here, is that I'm setting an attribute on the request for _view, and I'm setting it to list posts. And this is really important for moving down the road, because if you look at that layered approach to writing an application, the code that I'm working here, this list all posts interactor, which is part of the domain, that shouldn't know or care about how the page is actually going to be rendered. So it shouldn't have to know what view it's going to be used to display, because this works perfectly if you're going to a website. But if this was an API or a command line tool, how that response would be handled would be completely different. So then I have a new response that I create. Part of the reason that I have this pattern is like I said, because I have I've ported this demo from a separate thing that was using Radar, and in that case it was actually based off of PSR7, and so I was able to change all of that to use the HTTP Foundation request and response, but I've kept a lot of the same patterns in place. So we create a response, and that gets passed in. And all of these are callables, basically, so that they sort of function like they were closures. So I have this responder, which was passed in. As part of that, it takes 3 parameters. It takes the request that we just got in here that was modified with that view. It passes it in the new response, so there could be different types of responses that we want to be able to return from this. This gives us a little bit more flexibility in this method to determine how that works. And then the third parameter here is just the result that comes out of calling the action. So that was the list all posts action, or the use case. So let's break it down into what each of these pieces are. So let's start out with the list all posts interactor, because that's kind of one of the use cases of our application. So we go under interactor, list all posts. This is pretty much the simplest you can have, because it's not expecting any input. At some point you could, like let's say for instance you want to add pagination or something like this. There certainly could be a way that as part of this process you want to give it some parameters to say, okay, when I call this use case, I want to list all posts based on some process. And it's kind of your decision whether or not pagination is considered a part of your domain or if it's part of the delivery mechanism. I think it's still part of your domain, because even if it was coming through a command line tool or an API, you still wouldn't want to just return everything. You'd still want to have that functionality of give me a subset of this data, because I'm going to go through pages of it. You may not call it pagination because it might be, you might want to use a more generic term that would apply to these different cases, but you could see how something like that would be done. The way that I interact here is pretty simple. I just use arrays, but you could certainly create more sophisticated domain objects. So in this case, I'm just returning that the call was successful, and I return a list of posts, which just gets a list of posts from the post gateway. This is the next part that I will show. Post gateway is going to be, your data source. And so you're like, well, this is the use case, but the database is, part of that outside blue layer. How does this work? Well, the post gateway is just an interface. So we say, okay, we have a gateway for posts. We have 3 methods available: get all posts, get posts by ID, and save post, which gets a post entity. So this is totally kosher, because when you go into the list all posts, it just cares that something that implements that interface is being passed into it. It doesn't care how it's implemented. It just says this is the way that I want to communicate with it. So it's completely contained within that entity layer. So if you look at my code here, you'll see I have a post entity. This is what would be inside that inner yellow circle. We have a bunch of things that are sort of generic to a post. Title, content, excerpt, ID is optional. We have the ability to use it it basically is designed to be immutable, so you wouldn't actually change it. So if you want to assign an ID to it, you would actually just call the function with ID, and it would return a new object with the title, content, excerpt, and the ID. Some basic stuff: has ID, get the title, get the excerpt. If the excerpt is empty, it actually does a special thing, excerpt from content, and returns a substring for it with some ellipses at the end. Pretty simple stuff. This is your application independent or enterprise business logic. The interactors are the use cases, so that just says, okay, you know what? I want to get an array of posts that are available, so I ask from the post gateway, get me all those posts. Right away, that's where we start getting into that provider that I was talking about, because Laravel's dependency injection container is really smart about how to create new objects to pass in. But when it gets to this point, it's like, well, what it's expecting is an interface. I can't create a new interface. I need to know what to instantiate when somebody's asking for that. And that's where this app service provider comes into place. So right now, what I've done is I say, okay, we want to define a singleton that is for this interface. So post gateway here is that interface. So it says when somebody asks for that, what are we going to return? And so we go in here and we say, okay, well, here's a function that'll return it. In this case, we're creating a new blog data gateway post memory. And so this is in that data folder. So this is not officially part of the domain, but this is just part of my data use case, which you can almost think of as its own set of packages, for saying these are things that are going to implement the interfaces in my domain, but it's going to be part of your sort of delivery mechanism. So in theory, that's in there right now. This could have been moved up into your app class or something like that, because it's sort of part of the delivery mechanism of the system. So if we go in there to see what this particular one looks like, it doesn't really do anything with any outside system because it's not currently connecting to a database, but it just operates in memory. So it says, here's an array of posts. If we get all posts, we just return that array. If we get a post by ID, it goes through each of the posts, comparing those items with the IDs to say, is this ID the same? If it is, it returns it. Otherwise, it throws an exception that say no post was found with this ID. And then here's save post. It just goes through there. If it's missing an ID, it creates a new post with the same title, content, excerpt, but in this case with this specified unique ID. And then it goes through looking for anything that has that same existing ID. If it does, it updates it. Otherwise, it just adds it to that list. So it's nothing super smart, but it's something that if you were doing a unit test or something for that, which is also a delivery mechanism if you think about it, your unit tests are a separate thing from the web or from an API or command line. So that's another use case. That's another delivery mechanism as to how would this work. And so this is a super simple, fast thing. And so if we go into the app service provider, you'll see because we're not connecting to a persistent store, we do have to create some sample posts in there, which is what I have. So sample post 1, 2, and 3, I can put in here, excerpt. And so if we go back to the home page, you'll see that that changed to excerpt. So it's pulling out of that content. But if we put something in here, it's technically working, but because it's not persistent when it redirects to the home page, that was lost. Have I lost anybody yet? Are you everybody following?
So that didn't hit a database, you're still going kind of.
It's just working in its array, but since it's a new request, it's a new array, and so everything that was lost. It could theoretically, to make it sticky, you could do it in a session or something like that, but there's really no point in this, to do that. This is just a great, quick way to sort of implement it in the simplest way possible so you can get your application working before you make any decisions about how you actually want to store that data. So in this case, we're saying, okay, the post gateway is implemented currently by this post memory. We've set it up with these, seeded it with these three entities, post 1, 2, and 3. And so when we go to list all posts, the response from the action in this controller, so we go down here to list all posts, that gets this array, so success true, this post gateway get all posts, that's what it's returning. So that's what goes into this third parameter. So now we say, okay, well, what is this responder doing? So the responder is app HTTP responders HTML. So if we go up here to look at responders, it's asking for a Illuminate Contracts View Factory, which is what's going to, the main theme handling, blade compiling library that's part of Laravel. So we are, using Laravel for what it can do, pass that in as the constructor. And fortunately, Laravel's smart enough to wire that up automatically. We have that invoke method, which is what we're calling. We pass into it the request, a response. And in this case, what we're calling that array is just saying it's a payload. It's whatever is necessary to complete this request. It checks in the payload to see if the success value was set, and if it's true. If it was, then it says call success, otherwise call error. Success just sets the status code to 200, and then HTML body is just getting the view attribute, which we set back here to be list posts, but it has a default specified. Zoom this in a little bit so you can see that better. So if it wasn't specified, it would just use the default template. And so it gets that. Here's the view. It creates the template. So it says this factory make view. So that's what template we're using. This is the data we're passing in. This would be the same thing that you'd see, in a little bit more of a simplified way if you were using the normal view system in a controller. But this is more of the dependency injection way instead of using the global methods. We set the response header to be text HTML, and we set the content to be the rendered content from that view. If it was an error, we set the status code to 500. We change that view template to be the error template. So basically we say, okay, this is a completely different case. We don't want to display it the way it works normally. We're going to use a different template because this is going to have something different, which would be used in one of the other layers, which I'll show you in display single post controller. And so that would then also do HTML body, pulling in a different template and rendering it. And so then this just returns that response. List all posts returns that response. And so that's kind of the life cycle of this home page, right? So it gets that payload from the action. In this case, it didn't have to pass in any parameters, but we'll see that change in one of the next processes, one of the next controllers. Passes in the request and the response and that payload to the responder. The responder is what actually creates how that's going to be rendered, and that's what gets returned. So what's really nice about this is your controllers, instead of being that 2,000 line behemoth that I showed you in that DateCheck Pro demo, we have this very short, 28 line controller that is very succinct, that does one thing, and all of that code is very reusable. I could create, a command to, expose a command via artisan or something like that, that uses this same exact interactor, but would have a different responder, because it would be taking that response of an array of blog posts and whether or not it was successful, and would format it as something to be displayed to the command line. Or if I was doing something with a web API, I could have a completely separate section with its own controllers, and it would be returning a JSON response or something like that, where it's just taking that data, serializing it as JSON, and returning it. And so that would be, a completely different way of working with this. But you could see how by structuring it this way, that allows that logic to be completely reusable. When we move up to display single post controller, so that's when we click on one of these items, we have a ID in the URL that we want to use to decide which one to pull in. So this becomes a little bit more sophisticated. We still get the request like normal, but we also put in their ID so it knows how to populate that based on the router. We do the same, pretty much exactly the same thing as we had before. We have view. In this case, we're setting it to be single post. We create a new response, and we say this responder, request response, this action. Only in this case, we're passing an ID. And the action in this case is going to be a different interactor, display single post. If we look at that interactor, it looks very similar to the previous one. Only difference is it gets an ID passed into it, and it has a try-catch block, so that if it says post gateway, get post by ID, if it succeeded, then that's fine. We'll return that success true, and there's a post that it can interact with. If it caught that exception, it'll return that it was not successful, so success is false, and we specify a message that says, get the message from that exception. So that's kind of what we're doing there, which, like I showed you, if you look at that HTML responder, that's where it's checking here to say, was this successful or not? And so if we had that exception saying, hey, you know what, I looked in this, I asked the gateway for this particular post, it threw an exception saying that this didn't exist, it's going to show that different error message. So here, because one did exist, it outputs it correctly. If we went to one that didn't exist, it threw an exception, no post found with ID 7, and it was a different template. Any questions yet? No? The final controller here is to create a new post. And in this case, I decided to show, each of these cases kind of shows a different way that you could do this. One was just a very simple one, didn't take any input parameters. The next one just had a single parameter of an ID that you could pass in directly. This gave us another way that you could do this, especially if you have a little bit more complicated requests that you might want to do. So this does similar thing. We have an action being passed in. In this case, it's an interactor create new post. We have a redirect responder, which I'll show in a minute what that does, but I'm sure from the name you can kind of guess what it's going to do. We have the request coming in as part of that invoke. We create a new response just like we did previously. Only now this pace here gets a little bit more complicated. We say we want to return this responder with the parameters request response. And in this case, the parameter being passed to the action, instead of just being the raw data, which we certainly could have done, we could have just passed in the title, content, and the excerpt from that request directly into it. But to show how this could potentially work is by creating a create new post request, which I defined as part of that interactor, part of that use case layer. And that's essentially just a data transfer object. If we look in there, it doesn't do a whole lot. It takes title, content, excerpt, it assigns them, and then it has get title, get content, get excerpt. So it's just a simple data transfer object. But you know, you could certainly put something with validation in this layer. You could do a lot of different things if you need to sort of break out that process. So this showed a different way of using that. If we go down to the create new post interactor, you'll see that it's expecting a create new post request coming in, and that's what it uses. It creates a new post entity, get title, get content, get excerpt, and then it uses the post gateway to save that post, and it just returns that it was true. If we go to the redirect responder, it actually extends the HTML responder. The only difference is it overwrites that success one. So previously, if it was a success, it assigns a status code of 200 and renders the payload as an HTML response. Well, we don't want to do that in this case. We want to say get an attribute of redirect. So this is the same pattern as we were using with that view. But if you noticed, up in create new post controller, we didn't actually specify that. You know, here we have request attributes set view single post, but in this one we didn't actually set the variable that we're using here. And that was just a way of showing how you can still have a default value set. We could also have overwritten it. So if we had wanted to, there could potentially have been the ID of that post in the payload, and we could say that we want to actually redirect to that ID. But that would require a little bit more sophisticated processing that, you know, we could certainly do. All the pieces are there, but for this example, it didn't really matter. And so status code 301, and then we set the header location to that URL, which in this case is just the home page. So that doesn't do a whole lot. You'll see that if we go back to post memory, we do have save post and it's adding it, but like I said, it's not persistent, so there's no way of knowing for sure that it actually worked. So now what we have to do is say, okay, well now to get this piece working, we have to connect it to a database of some sort. So the simplest way for me to do that was just to use a SQLite database. So if we go under config, database, default connection is SQLite. We just have it defined as the database path, database.sqlite. Pretty simple. If we go under here, there is a file, database SQLite specified. It should be empty at this point, doesn't do anything. And so that's where I set up that migration to say create a posts table with an ID, title, content, excerpt, and some timestamps. We can go to the terminal then. Let's see. Oh, well, that's why I have to go into Vagrant. Still didn't work. Hey, there we go. Okay, so table created successfully. We ran that migration. We can actually exit. Oop. And if you guys want to actually see that, we can go and open that up. And so we have a posts table here. I don't know if we could actually zoom this in at all. There we go. ID, title, content, excerpt, and then the timestamps that it created automatically were created at and updated at. Super simple. Let's go back in the code. We need to create, in this case then, an alternative gateway implementation. So I say post eloquent. You know, since the whole point of using Laravel is to leverage the tools that it provides for you, I wrote this implementation using the eloquent ORM. So get all posts uses the domain, let's see here, app post, which is part of here. Just your very basic eloquent model named post, so it uses all of the defaults. Doesn't do anything fancy. It's the basic ORM. And so it says get all the posts. Each of those posts, I created this little method down here called post to entity. So it returns a new post entity, which is the object, you know, from my actual domain. And it just assigns it with the title, content, excerpt, and ID. So it creates an array of those entities and it returns the posts. Get post by ID, same sort of thing. Post find. If it's not there, there's an exception. Otherwise, it returns it as an entity. And then save post has a couple different pieces here. If the ID is present, it calls replace post. And so it tries to get the post by ID, change it, and save it. Otherwise, it just defaults to inserting it. And inserting just creates a new post with those values and saves it, which would generate a new ID for it. So we're leveraging the eloquent ORM, which is one of the things that people really like about Laravel, is that it makes it really easy to work with the database. But at any point you could change this. So if you found that, you know, in a couple of reports or something, this isn't really cutting it, you could replace this with something else and use PDO directly or something like that. So here is this implementation, but we now have to swap that out. So we go under providers, app service provider. In this case, all of the stuff that we did previously, we can comment out and instead just return a post eloquent object. And now, if we go back to the home page, there's no posts present at all because it's an empty database. We can give it an excerpt if we want, saying, yo, yo, yo. Save the post. And boom, we have that data with the excerpt, the full content. And if we go into the database here, you'll see that that's shown up in there with an ID, title, content, excerpt, and the dates, just as we expected. Without, we were able to swap out the data source entirely without having to change any of the rest of the code, which is part of that flexibility. So now, looking at this code, you can see how we have, we've had to put a little extra work in to separate the layers we could have implemented this application straight in the controllers using the eloquent ORM and the default view handlers, but it wouldn't have been reusable. And so by just keeping these couple of principles in mind and that idea of the different nested layers, we've really future-proofed our application so that, even in Laravel's history, I think it was between Laravel 3 and 4, there were substantial architectural changes that were made that caused a lot of people stress because they had to rewrite their applications if they wanted to use the new features of the new Laravel. I think that Laravel has sort of learned that that was not a good thing and was a little bit better about it when it switched from 4 to 5. But this is the case with any framework or delivery mechanism that you're using. Let's say, for instance, you want to build an application on Drupal. Drupal is known that every major version that comes out is not going to be backwards compatible with its previous version. And so if you want to leverage everything that Drupal provides to you, you're going to have to look at it and see what are you going to base it on, what logic is sort of separate from Drupal. If you build everything on top of views and CCK, you're going to be kind of stuck because that's, about as highly coupled as you can get. But if you really code your application in this sort of a structure and create Drupal modules that leverage the good parts of Drupal, but keep them very siloed out into their own separate things with their own separate interfaces and let your core code work, it basically takes, every time that you want to switch to a new version of Drupal, it takes the amount of work necessary into a much smaller subset. Because the pieces that have changed you have to rewrite, but hopefully that's just a small subset of your application at that point. But this is the same thing. Laravel is great, and maybe you build your application to start out with this way, and it's working, but you get really successful, and you find that you have to start splitting up your application into different microservices and say, okay, this can't run all in the same process anymore, so this part of the code we have to move to its own server and just put behind an API, or we have to set this stuff up to run as part of a message queue that we're running with RabbitMQ or something like that, and these things will be handled off of workers. Well, that's fine. It's not going to cause you that much stress because all of that business logic that you have can just be moved over to those new things and just wrapped in a different delivery mechanism. So that's why I was saying, the stuff that's in this source folder, this could just as easily be in its own completely separate PHP package, composer package that you have on GitHub, and you just add that to the different applications. And so you might have now two Laravel applications. One that's an API that provides services for this, or something that gets triggered from a message queue. And then you have the main front end that actually handles the interaction to the web user interface that you have. But it all of a sudden became a much less painful transition because all of that code was set up to be separate. And if you look at this, the same sort of thing. If you have this code and you want to interject a caching layer, there's no reason you couldn't implement some of the same interfaces and even just use it as a decorator or something like that. Say, okay, well, I'm going to create a, for my post gateway, I'm going to, in addition to having the, the post eloquent, I'm going to have a post memcache or something. And it would get a post eloquent passed into it as part of its constructor, so that when you are running it, it could first check to see if that post is available in memcache. If it is, it uses that. If it doesn't, it asks its internal post gateway and say, okay, I can't handle this, I need to get that data from you, and it just passes it on to the next guy, and you can kind of nest those things together. And all of a sudden you've added a sophisticated caching layer without having to actually change anything else. You've just created a new class and wired it up a little bit differently in your app service provider. But you've just added this whole caching layer that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Questions, comments?
Yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to take advantage of, say, like the Laravel validation methods or something like that, where would that fit in, do you think?
The way I would use that is similar to the way I'm wrapping Eloquent. So what I would do is I would create a validation interface of some sort in my domain to say validate this entity, with the idea of saying I don't care how that's validated, just validate it for me. And then you could create an implementation that used Laravel's validation on that data and returned something in the context of the domain so that it did its own thing, but as far as the domain's concerned, it's a black box. It just did it. Now, if you're doing validation on a higher level of saying like the form content comes in, well, you might want to do that in a little bit different way and have that as sort of part of the controller or something like that if you're going to, have Laravel generating the forms for you or something like that. Like I said, I'm not super into Laravel, so I don't know the exact implementation of some of this validation stuff.
And I know that one thing where just raised a red flag was I know that they'll, if it detects an error or it doesn't validate, it will automatically redirect for you.
Sure.
And then, put stuff, flash stuff to the session in various places like that. So
Right.
That, of course, is nice, but it also couples you to, expecting, that redirect to happen because of that validation. So.
But even then, that's not really the end of the world, because if you think about it, that is very much part of the delivery mechanism. And so you could almost say that part of your delivery mechanism is that there's a first phase, if you will, of validation. And that can throw stuff, it can spit it out to the UI. That's all living in that layer, right? It's all up there. It doesn't actually get in layer. But if it gets past that layer and says, okay, this layer considers it's validated, then that data goes into the use case and in the domain at that point, and it might have its own validation inside of that, but there's no reason you couldn't keep that on the outside. Just know that that's not a reusable piece of validation. If it's important to have that piece be completely reusable, then yeah, you'd want to put that inside of your domain and handle that more manually. But if you like that for the web, there's no reason you couldn't use that, but just realize that that piece wouldn't be reusable.
Yeah, and you'd also have to realize that if it's important that validation happen every time, that you need to bring it closer to the use case or
Right.
the entity. Because otherwise, command line or API, all of
Yeah.
that's getting bypassed.
And so you'd still definitely want to have some sort of validation internally.
Yeah. I guess it really just depends on whether or not that's more, user level friendly validation or, protect the data, make sure our app doesn't break
Right.
validation.
Yeah, because there's definitely, there's a lot about Laravel that sort of rubbed me the wrong way when I first started looking at it, mostly because there were things that I had originally liked about Kohana. It's like, oh, this makes it really easy with Kohana, but it all bit me in the butt. And so now I go to Laravel, it's like, ooh, all these static method calls everywhere makes me really nervous.
Yeah.
But, once you look into it a little bit, it's like, well, that's really a very lightweight layer on top of an actual dependency injection, inversion of control layer, where I'm actually pretty happy with the way it worked. The only one that didn't work out perfectly was in this post-eloquent one. And that's because kind of the way the model stuff works is you're kind of stuck with some of that static stuff. I may have been able to dig into it a little bit more and find a way to, put a factory object or something into a constructor to use. But, for this demo, it was certainly easier to just say I'm going to use app post and use the static methods that I would normally, because it's fairly limited to just this single class.
Yeah, we usually try to hide all of those kind of static facade methods behind some sort of implementation of an interface, so they're all wrapped into the same section. So if we swap it out later,
right,
it's all it's all consolidated.
But even in here, I was really happy to see that, the view factory was able to just be injected, and I could use that directly without having to use any of those static methods or global functions to just render a template. And so that was really nice to be able to do that kind of stuff. There's going to be areas where it's not practical, so I stuck with the static calls for the route because, could I get around that? Yeah, there's ways of doing it, but you have to pick your battles. And I think for me, it's more important to maintain that level of discipline when you're working with your inner layers of things. You certainly wouldn't want to be calling those static methods from something in like one of your entities or something like that. You want to really separate it out. But yeah, Laravel is always, they're just creating such a huge platform of just phenomenal code that makes everyone's life easier. I haven't dug into it, but I'm impressed by, their whole event system where, you can do it all internally right away, or you can wire it up to use an external event queue or something like that and trigger stuff independently. Like that kind of stuff, it's like, well, that's great, but it's still a delivery mechanism. I wouldn't bake that into like the core of my domain, but by all means, use it. There's no reason you need to reinvent everything yourself. Like, use the stuff that's there. That's why you're using the framework. But it's certainly better if these frameworks are built in component, type systems, because like here, for instance, I can use the Eloquent ORM. I can use the Blade templating engine. And even if I moved it so that the router was, a Symfony router and I was actually using it all as Silex, I could still use the ORM and the Blade templating as separate things, just as components as part of my application, from what I understand.
Are there questions that you ask yourself before putting in the extra effort to make the better code? I'm not saying that this isn't the better way to do it, but it seems like I kind of want to have a threshold that I want to get past before I want to put in the extra mind.
Right.
Like the extra effort of making it kind of framework agnostic. Do you have any rules of thumb, or is it just because I can?
I probably wouldn't go through this level of stuff if I'm doing a simple throwaway app.
Right.
There's a little utility thing for myself. But if I'm going to be doing something that I know I'm going to be working on for an extended period of time, it makes sense to do that. But there's always exceptions. Like, I tried to stick with this kind of a structure, not exactly this formalized, but an earlier version of this when I built our second product, Taskle. And it's not perfect. There's a lot of areas where I just didn't have time to do those layers. And so especially around reporting, where we're dealing with major performance issues and changing it on an almost day-to-day basis in some cases as to how it's going to work, because we're trying to just get something that works that we can ship to our customers. Yeah, I might do all of the work, higher up in the controllers and stuff like this, and we have big messy things up there as well. But at least in those cases, it's very clear that we're breaking the rules at that point. And once we get that stable, it's also a clear point of entry to say, okay, well, now we're going to rewrite it to this more, structured type system.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's, more than one person looks at the code. The app is probably going to stay around for a while. You want to keep using nice things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just, it's interesting to ask the questions before you start, but, you probably can delude yourself into thinking, it's not going to be that important.
And then the other way to look at it, though, is that, you look at this as saying, your question sort of presupposes that you've decided, let's say, that it's going to be a Laravel application. Right? Let's say you're building something new from scratch. Why don't you just postpone that decision? Say, I don't know what framework I want to use yet. I want to start getting something working, you could start creating your, domain, the entities and the use cases simply with PHP unit as its only delivery mechanism, and start testing out algorithms, get things working. You could even start to put, gateways into place if you needed to do some more logic in the database, and put your own, larger tests around that to say, okay, well, before we push to production, we're going to have to run these tests against, a test database or a SQLite database or something like that, and start getting that stuff working. And you could have 90% of your application done before you've even decided if you're going to use Laravel or Symfony or Silex or Slim or whatever else if you're going to do it.
That makes sense. Because that way it gets you out of the mindset of framework shopping and faster into the, well, what is it actually going to do? What makes this unique? And what's important about what I'm trying to write? And those are better questions than, oh, okay, well, API platform exists now. And what about X and what about Y? And then just rather than just kind of asking questions to the community and seeing how much they make fun of you or insult you, to actually just write the app that does seem like a better way.
I know, 10 to 12 years ago, a lot of developers I was working with, we said, oh, we're never going to need to swap out the database. We're never going to, we don't need the flexibility. We're just going to code it to this way. Thinking that 3 to 5 years we're going to rewrite the app in the new technology. Well, some of those apps are still running, and now we're like, how on earth do we get them to run on PHP 5.4 or 5.5 or 5.6? And now the MySQL query commands are getting deprecated in 7. So it's like all those hard-coded things where we just took what seemed to be the easy way a long time ago are going to cause us a lot of work now later down the road. So we always kind of assume that our apps are going to be, now we always assume that they're going to be running a lot longer than we first expect. But we just don't have the time to re-architect or so as much as we can, any logic that we can pull forward with whatever the new technology is, it just saves us a ton of time down the road.
Yeah, and by doing it, this kind of backwards way of coming in with the, PHP unit as the delivery mechanism of your app, that sort of makes you architect it in a very testable way, so that if you do actually get that done with 100% test coverage and you want to switch something down the road, like you can do it without any stress, because you can immediately run those tests and see, is it actually working or not? But when when I built some of that stuff like for DayCheck Pro, even if I wanted to, there's no way I could write a unit test against that now. Like even using something like Selenium, there's just so many permutations to run through that, anything could happen to make it fail sporadically. And it's like, well, there wasn't actually a bug. It was just like this happened. Or Linode was getting a DOS attack and I couldn't connect to my database. Like that's weird. Like even when they're not officially having problems, periodically I have problems where over the local internal network I lose connections to my database. It's like that shouldn't have happened. Why did that happen? I don't know. Or things like I'm trying to upload something to Amazon S3 and every, I don't know, week or two, I'll have some instance where it's like, oh, can't connect, retrying 3 seconds, and then it was able to get through. It's like, I don't know if Amazon just had a hiccup or if the network connection dropped or who knows. So there's always weird edge cases, but when you do it this way, you know that a lot of those pieces really work, because if you have a really properly built application, What was interesting about this is that when I switched from just the in-memory to the Eloquent backend, I didn't actually, I had to change the dependency injection part, which you're sort of anticipating. It's like the part you would change. But I didn't actually change any of the other code. I just created a new class and said, well, now I'm going to use this class instead of this other class. And everything just continued to work. Ideally, that's the way it works, is that once you've written something that works, it never has to be touched again. If you want to change the functionality, you're changing the functionality by, wrapping it in a decorator, creating another version of it, that does things differently. You're not actually hacking that code unless there's a bug or something like that you found. The other thing with this that I found to be problematic is that it's very easy once you start getting stressed out and hitting tight deadlines that you stop keeping your interfaces up to date. You would just go into post Eloquent and add more methods and then start calling them from the provider, which is obviously a mistake, but there's going to be tools. I don't know if Code Climate does that or not. Would it be able to identify that you're officially coding against this interface, but the functions you're calling aren't defined in that interface?
No. Well,
It does function like
it does. Well, yeah, it does function like, but I don't know that it evaluates anything in the function.
Code Sniffer might find it.
Yeah, Code Sniffer might. But Code Climate now is just sort of like Scrutinizer, where they're just using open source tools to scan things. So if there's an open source tool, that'll do it. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, because I didn't actually think Code Sniffer was able to do a lot of stuff until recently. I wanted to sort of clean up my, I had a WordPress plugin I wanted to clean up. And so I downloaded the rule set for WordPress, and I was shocked at the sort of things it was able to identify. Like, this variable wasn't escaped properly. It's like, how the hell do you know that? Because it was able to figure out that the variable you're using didn't go through one of these whitelisted functions or something. And so I was like,
as long as you're not easily offended, Code Sniffer can do plenty of things for you.
if you work with it from the beginning, you end up with a very, you end up solving a lot of problems that you may not have gotten otherwise. But yeah, so if you have a tool that's able to statically analyze, I think, because of the way PHP 7 was written, I think you're going to get a lot more static analytical tools for PHP coming out of it. Or transpiling. Any other questions? No? All right. Let's see, I think I have one last slide.
I will try to for you too.
Let's put that in there. Okay.
All right. HTTPS. Join.in/talk/7 8 lowercase f as in Frank 7 lowercase a.
Is there a slash at the end? Nope.
Oh, I think it was but officially there's not.
Boom. There you go. So if you have questions, that's a form to email me, and the source code for this, as well as the joined in talk, where you can post comments or rating it or whatever you'd like. Plus, I will probably upload this video and post a link like I did with some of the other stuff. Because why not?
Exactly.
Of course, if anybody's not showing up to the meetings and they're just following me, they're like, what the hell? This is a new presentation. It's the same shit as the last two. What the hell? But this is definitely a new thing for me. Like, This is the first talk that I've given more than once, or that have like evolved on. Because I was sort of inspired by Beth and Bo of like their list of talks that they can just submit to things instead of all these one-off talks that I was doing.
The old standbys that just always seem to be like, talk to him, talk, like I've seen that presentation before and I still want it again. So I mean, this seems like one of those, like, just like Jones is modernizing legacy PHP. Like, you seem to always need the advice, even if you've heard it before. Write clean code, think about it ahead of time, think your stuff out, think about what it, think about what it'll mean to try to change a framework or an implementation of something. If it gives you a panic attack, then start to prevent that panic attack today.
Yeah, so if you guys have any other questions, follow up with me. If you have other suggestions for talks that are sort of spin-offs of this with different content, let me know as well, because I may start a new talk process. All right. Thank you guys for coming.